Time for a pop quiz. Can you name the first American production sports car built after World War II? Well, if you named anything other than the Crosley Hot Shot, you're wrong. Hi there, Rick DeBrule. Hang on, wait a minute. If I'm going to talk about the Crosley Hot Shot, then I really need to get down to its level. All right, Rick DeBrule with another chapter in the automotive evolution. Once again, I'm here at the Martin Auto Museum in Phoenix. As I've told you before, this is a wonderful collection with more than 180 cars and trucks, some very well known, others practically forgotten, like this 1950 Crosley Hot Shot. Now, I'm going to tell you more about this car, and I'm also going to give you an amazing piece of racing trivia that you're going to want to remember. I'll tell you about that in just a moment. But you're also right about now thinking, wait a minute, this doesn't look like the museum. I mean, I'm sitting here on carpeting, right? Why would we have carpeting under the cars? Well, that's because right now I'm in our ballroom. Now, officially, this is the Martin Auto Museum and Event Center. This ballroom will seat 500 people, and it's a great place for corporate functions, celebrations, weddings. We have high school proms here. The kids love walking around the cars. It's one of several rooms we have available, and maybe we'll talk more about that at a later date. But before I talk about this Crosley, make sure you like and subscribe. And in the comments down below, let me know what I got right, what I got wrong. There's always something I get wrong. And if you've ever even heard of a Crosley or ridden in one. So why do I call this the first post-war American sports car? Well, it was built for just one purpose, to have fun. A small two-seat runabout with no top. Now, some folks might argue that the Curtiss sports car was first, but it barely had a production of maybe 15 or 20 built in 1949. And Curtiss didn't even use its own chassis or engine. There was the Muntz jet, which morphed from the Curtiss. And while some sources say they built cars in 1949, I don't think production really started until 1950. Besides, it was more of a personal luxury car. The Nash Healey, well, that didn't show up until 1951, and it was half British. And of course, we all know the story of how the Corvette arrived in 1953, redefining the American sports car. Which means that when Crosley, this hot shot, hit the streets in 1949 with more than 750 produced, it was blazing a trail in a whole new market, the affordable American sports car. But before I talk too much about this hotshot, I do need to give a brief history of the Crosley Automobile Company and its visionary founder, Powell Crosley. You see, Powell Crosley is the guy who looked at the earliest radios and thought, there's got to be a simpler and cheaper way to do this. His $7 radio made him the Henry Ford of broadcasting. He then built a radio station so people had something to listen to. He created soap operas aimed at getting housewives to listen during the day. He bought the Cincinnati Reds and installed the first Major League Baseball lights so people could listen to games in the evening. But Crosley really wanted to build cars. In fact, in the early years, he worked in various automotive companies and made his first fortune manufacturing car accessories. Crosley Motors built its first production car in 1939, but ever the visionary, Powell felt he needed to do something different. People were still feeling the effects of the Depression, so he created a small, compact car that was inexpensive to buy and to run. It had a two-cylinder engine and mechanical brakes. Early ads show that the car cost less than $300 new. Crosley had big plans, and then World War II hit. Like other car builders, the Crosley factory was converted to wartime production. They started building cars again in 1946, and they had a full range. They had sedans, wagons, small trucks. Crosley even coined the term sport utility for one of its models. And then in 1949, they introduced the Hot Shot. Let's walk around and get a closer look at our 1950 Crosley Hot Shot. And we're going to start with that logo, that, call it a crest of arms that's up front, because I always laugh. You know, the car is so small, but boy, that crest of arms on the front, the name just stands right out. Very tiny thing. It only weighs like 11 or 1,200 pounds. It has an 85-inch wheelbase, which is pretty significant because the normal Crosley had an 80-inch wheelbase. So what they did was they were able to stretch the wheelbase out about 5 inches, and that actually gave it a slightly better weight distribution. This is a door that's on the side. As you can see, it's pretty flimsy. The original Crosley Hot Shots did not come with doors. It wasn't until I think you ordered the supermodel or later years where you were finally able to get a door. And when I say door, it's pretty rudimentary. I mean, it doesn't take much to take it off there. And I think a lot of people who are racing would take that off because you didn't need that extra weight. Rolling around to the back, very streamlined shape. Of course, no trunk that you get access to from the outside. This is where the spare tire is mounted. If you wanted to get access to the, well, call it the luggage area, that was underneath there, simply behind the seats. In the back, it looks like we only have 2 reflectors on either side and then a tail light right here. You have to remember that turn signals, I don't think the United States federal law required them until like 1969. Washington State, I believe, was the first state to require them in 1954. So when this was built, there was no requirement that you needed turn signals. Some of the cars, like I think Buicks, for example, other cars had them earlier, but in terms of whether it was a requirement, they weren't. So if you were building a small, lightweight car like the Crosley Hot Shot, you absolutely weren't going to put those on because, well, why? It actually had pretty good suspension all the way around. It had hydraulic shocks on either side, independent front suspension. You had 6 elliptical springs on the left side, 5 on the right. You had leaf and coil springs in the back. You know, it was actually not a bad car from a performance perspective for its day. Funny thing about this hood, we'll go inside there in a little bit and talk about the engine, but there's no hinges on this hood. It is simply kind of pops into place. It also came with a cloth top, but once again, people who were, you know, just going out for fun were probably taking that off because that, once again, that just added extra weight. This is interesting right here. If you look at a Thunderbird, a little flap like this little door, would be there specifically to let air into the inside of the car because it could get kind of warm. That's not what this is here for. This is actually to release engine heat from the inside of the engine or to pull cool air in. So that's actually just going into the engine compartment. It's not going into the passenger compartment as you might first expect. Now, because they were light and nimble, plenty of people use them for racing, which leads to the Hot Shot's shining moment of glory. It happened at the very first race held at Sebring in 1950. Fritz Koster and Ralph Bobby Deschamps were entered with a Hot Shot. Now, they were up against Ferraris and Aston Martins, they were against Jaguars, they were against Healeys, and needless to say, those big sports cars were much, much, much faster. But back then, winning wasn't about pure speed. It was about something called the index of performance. Each car had a target speed and distance it was supposed to meet. Bigger cars went further, smaller cars, well, not so much. The winner would be the car that exceeded its targets by the greatest percentage. The idea was to create a race where small cars could compete against the big cars. And it worked. Well, sort of. When the race was over and the math was calculated, the Crosley Hot Shot was declared the winner, having beat its goals by the greatest margin, more than any other car. Tiny David had beaten all of the Goliaths. Now, as I mentioned, there were no hinges for the hood. It simply had these clips that kept it in place. So if you wanted to work on the engine, you simply set that aside. And underneath, well, we have a 4-cylinder, 44 cubic inch engine. For you liter people, that's just 0.7. Earlier versions of the Crosley had used something called the Cobra, that's Cobra engine, which stood for copper brazed, instead of a traditional cast iron block. The Cobra design used steel stampings that were then brazed together with copper. But by 1950, Chrysler had switched to the Seba engine, stood for cast iron block assembly. It was the same basic 4-cylinder layout, but instead of copper brazed material, it was a conventional cast iron block. It was considered more durable than the copper brazed version, although it's a shame that they lost that Cobra name. Unusual for the day is the fact that this engine right here uses a single overhead camshaft, has a Tillotson single barrel carburetor, and that was mated up to a 3-speed transmission and what's called a Spicer differential. Now, this engine only made about 26 horsepower at 5,200 RPM, but when you remember that this car only weighed 1,100 pounds, it actually gave relatively peppy performance. Now, as I mentioned, the original Hot Shot did not come with doors. This was an option later in the Hot Shot world. And these doors don't actually have any real latch, right? All it has is this little section right here that pops up. And by the way, if you want to take the door off completely and go racing, boom, just that easy. And then you just set it aside. So it wasn't much. And then you look at how this low sill is. Imagine you're racing around Sebring, and this is all you have holding you in, because remember, back in those days, they weren't using seat belts. Once you get in, well, it's like any other sports car. It's actually relatively low to the ground. Seating position, you know, it's a little more upright than you'd probably normally like, but it's all things considered not bad. Interesting, I have wide shoes, and to be honest with you, it's actually hard to get to the accelerator around the brake pedal down there. Once you're in, does everything you needed to do, right? Fairly large steering wheel. Remember, they didn't have power steering, although for a vehicle this size, you didn't really need it. Nice array of gauges. Of course, you have the speedometer right here, amps, fuel, water temperature, that type of thing. Interestingly enough, there is a place and an option was available to put a radio in a Crosley. Not sure how many people bought it. And you would think, well, why would you do that in such a rudimentary car? Well, you have to remember, Powell Crosley made his fortune selling radios to the masses. You know, an inexpensive radio people could put in their homes. So to have one in a car only made sense. Even in a car like this, it was going to be an option. Not sure how many people bought them, but it was an optional. Though here we have the little panel. We'll call this a radio delete car. I love the glove compartment here, because that is one of the tiniest glove boxes I have ever seen. Relatively deep, but boy, not very big on the outside. There were certain options that you could get. For example, you could get a heater. This is equipped with the heater. You see it down here. So you could have the air heated on those cold days. I think an ashtray was an option. You actually had to pay extra if you wanted that. This was, as I mentioned, the luggage space back here. Although interesting, as I look back, remember I mentioned on the outside, I wasn't sure if those two red lights on either side were reflectors or lights. Well, it turns out they are wired. So they are actual lights in the back. Not a lot of space for luggage, but you know, enough for your overnight bag if that's what you were going to do. This car was not fast. Now, when I was looking at the engine, I talked about peppy performance. Peppy in this car meant 0 to 60 in 32 seconds. But you have to remember, a lot of the inexpensive sports cars back in those days really didn't have speed. They were all about cornering ability. And that's where this car could do fine, right? Once you got it up to speed, you could fling yourself through a corner with decent suspension all the way around and maintain your speed. But imagine, you're at Sebring and you're whipping along and you've got a top speed in this thing of, I think, 72, 73 miles an hour. And there's Jaguars and Ferraris and, you know, Healey's rolling right past you. And you've got to maintain that speed as much as you can. Imagine how frightening it was with that differential of speed, which is always a crisis and a potential concern on any racetrack. When this was new in 1949, the base price for this was $849. By the time you got to 1950, when this model came out, this exact car came out, it moved up to $872. Of course, that was before you had all your big options like a heater or a radio or the ashtray. But once again, this was all about affordable fun. Crosley was all about building affordable small cars to start with, and having an affordable small car that was pure fun, well, it just took it to the next level. I should mention that here at the Martin Auto Museum, we have one of the better collections of Crosleys. And this, for example, is a 1948 model. We've got our Hot Shot. We've got another 1948 model. That one is a cloth top. It's called a CC. All right, I got the Chevy sitting in the middle, but this is interesting over here. This is a 1939 Crosley, which was the original year that Crosley started to build cars, and making the point that they were trying to build things that fit a wide variety of buyers. Here was their station wagon, which looked like a classic American station wagon, just a little bit smaller. Even had that, you know, airplane stylized hood ornament. Crosley had a decent run for a while. It sold more than 80,000 cars after World War II. Nearly 2,500 of those were the Hot Shots like this one. Crosley's sales peaked in 1948 with more than 25,000 cars built and sold, and then the numbers started to slide. You know, America was booming after World War II. Americans wanted bigger, flashier. The idea of the compact car really wouldn't even start to grab hold until the late 1950s when the economy faltered. Crosley finally admitted defeat in 1952, closing its automotive doors for good. Pal Crosley didn't have the wrong idea. He just had the wrong idea for the time. Years later, subcompacts would become big sellers. And for a brief moment, the Crosley Hot Shot showed that this company that specialized in small cars was more than just about saving money. It was also ready to have fun.